Welcome to the Otherweb. Our guest today is Charles Key. Charles was born in Oklahoma and has been in local politics for most of his adult life. He is the author of Stolen Government, a book that outlines some of the key issues that cause politicians to represent something other than voters. Charles, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you on. So you wrote a book recently called Stolen Government. Who stole it?
Well, that's a good question. Is probably one answer is we all did. We allowed people that we elected to go to office, to go up there, and we didn't provide the oversight that really is necessary. And there's some old sayings. One of them is when the cat's away, the mice will play, and there's other variations on that. What happens is there's a lot of people that go up to state legislatures and the federal government, the federal legislature, and they're up there every day, and they've got an agenda. They've got things they either want to get passed or they want to kill or change in our laws. And so people that are looking to get things just for themselves, whether that's monetary or power, are ultimately the ones that stole the government by changing the way things are supposed to work in the American system of government, particularly in the legislative branch.
So I understand there are some people, lobbyists, let's say, but I'm sure there are more categories who have a specific agenda, and obviously they have more proximity to the representatives. But still, there's something that makes the representatives follow what the lobbyist said and not what the people in his or her district said. What is that?
Well, it's more than one thing, and it's not always the same thing for everyone. So the way I like to handle this part of the discussion is, we elect people to go and represent us. In the state level, every 2 years, and actually every 2 years in our country, we have an election. And every 2 years in the state House of Representatives and the federal House of Representatives, we actually re-elect or elect a new legislature. And technically, the way that works is it's easy for all of us to think, and I thought this way back in the day before I got very involved in politics, that the legislature is a perpetual organization. On a technical basis, it's really not. Every 2 years, we create a new legislative body. So for example, at this period of time, we're coming to the end of a 2-year cycle. And that legislative body will actually cease to exist until it's elected and then take the oath of office. And then when it goes into its first day of session, this is common with every House and every Senate, they have to acquire rules because, again, we would generally assume they just pick the old ones up and it's some kind of automatic procedure. The only automatic part about it is the newly elected legislature will then, as their first course of business, take the old rules because they need some rules to operate under. And they'll continue to use those rules. Now, what will happen is some of the, quote, leaders in that legislative body may want to change some of those rules on that first day, but typically they just have to acquire the rules to have rules to operate by. And if they want to change something, they will. But they do not like to spend time in the rules, and they don't like to come back and revisit it ever again in that 2-year cycle because it opens up a potential can of worms for other members to then bring in changes or reforms like my book is about and like we're talking about today. So it's important to lay that groundwork because then whatever the rules were in the previous legislative session are likely going to remain the same. And like most states and the federal legislature, if they acquire those same rules, then those rules are very heavily give power to the Speaker of the House, who then divvies out that power to his committee chairman and the floor leader and a few others like that. But essentially what's going on is the Speaker of the House, or the Speaker pro tem as it's called in the U.S. Senate and the state Senates, have almost total power to decide the membership of every committee. And they also have the total power to decide who the chairman of every committee will be and the vice chairman of every committee. And it's still not over. They have the power to assign bills to whatever committee they want to. Now, typically, they'll assign a bill that's on education to education or agriculture to the agriculture committee. But in our state, in most of the other states, they don't really have to do that. And then sometimes a little side note here is a trick of the trade is to assign a bill to more than one committee in which it has to pass all those committees to get out and have the chance of going to the floor. So that's kind of the overview. I would say this, and I'll take a breath and let you ask me questions next, or whichever direction you want to go. But when I first got elected in 1986, and my first year was 1987, and I served for 12 straight years, I was told right off the bat, not too long after I got elected and filed a few bills, I was told by a committee chairman he wasn't going to put one of my bills on the agenda for that committee. And I was not prepared for that. I was surprised. I was pretty well informed, I would say, better than the average person that comes up there for the first time. But I was surprised because this is kind of a well-kept secret or just an unknown. People don't realize how these internal workings work. And so I was surprised when here I am in Oklahoma, we have 101 House members, same number of people in each district elect a person. And now someone who happened to be appointed to be a chairman of a committee is telling another equally duly elected member, no, you won't be heard. And it translated to make me realize that they weren't just saying no to me, and it ticked me off, but they were really saying no to all those people. They weren't going to have a voice, or at least not an equal voice like others. And that really is where this all started.
Right. So that is fascinating to me. And I know nothing about the rules that govern the behavior of the legislative body. But before we dive into the rules, I want to ask you a personnel question. I heard somewhere that in the federal House of Representatives, there is something like a 97% incumbency rate. That for the most part, people just get reelected because the incumbent can raise a lot more money than somebody trying to challenge them. The incumbent generally, in many cases, even gets to affect the redistricting because they've been there for so long. Then they've gone through one cycle of redistricting and they get to pick their own voters to make sure that they stay in office. And then eventually, when you talk about people at the heads of committees, those are usually people who have been in Congress for a long time. They've accumulated tenure, I guess. And so they end up in that position just because they've been reelected so many times. And so shouldn't we look at basically the personnel question of how do we get more turnover in Congress as one of the ways to affect those rules that favor the incumbents and the long-timers?
Yes, but that's even harder than this. This is very hard. It's all hard. It's not easy to reform it. Mm-hmm. But it is a good point, and it is something that people have talked about and tried to do for a long time. And think about, I just turned 70 years old this year. And when I think back of how many times I've heard in my adult lifetime, since I've been paying attention to things like this, people say, vote them all out. I'm going to vote no on every incumbent and whomever. I've never seen that happen. But I will tell you, this year in Oklahoma, and we're still coming up to our final general election, we had a primary and a runoff. We booted out a lot of incumbents, more than I've ever seen, not just in our state, but anywhere in our country since I've been paying attention for 45 or 50 years. And so there is something going on now, but still yet there's not a wholesale effort like that. And so what this will do, the thing that we still haven't really dug into it yet, of course, but it will stop that process of a chairman, a floor leader, a speaker, any other member. It doesn't matter if somebody gives them a wonderful title or something. They don't have any more power than anybody else. And so it prohibits one member denying another member the right to have their bill heard if they simply make it clear in writing, I want my bill heard in committee. And then the rule change would say if it passes out of committee, that same legislator does the same thing to the speaker or floor leader. Hey, my bill passed out of committee. I want it heard on the floor. then they must hear it. And what that will do, it will, of course, give hearing to issues that special interest groups or others, big donors, don't want. And that's who's really controlling and driving all of this. But it will also start creating a record that right now voters don't have. Because a legislator can say almost anything, to a constituent. And I've got some stories we can talk about as we go along here, real stories of what legislators tell constituents.
Okay. So let's dig into that. I want to understand that. I think I also have a better than average understanding of basically how American civics work. But bear in mind, I wasn't born here. I grew up in Israel. So my understanding of the US is that of a foreigner looking in, even though I've been here for a while. So what you're proposing is, I guess, a bill that Congress or Senate or both bodies in each state have to pass that would place limitations on the rules that those bodies can then set to govern themselves. Is that correct?
Pretty much. Actually, here's a copy of the book right here. It's pretty short. It's just about 100 pages, and it's real easy to read. It had been, back to my story again, I think we'll get to this question, is as time went on, I started learning, well, how does this work and how do you change this? So I started filing bills. You actually file a bill to change the rules. The rules are a separate set of standards that are just for the legislature. But I started filing bills to change the rules. And then eventually I started filing bills that would create a law, statutory or constitutional, to just flat out prohibit this. Well, what I've learned along the way and what we talk about in the book is that there are about half the states operate like we're talking about right now. They let the speaker pro tem, to have all this power. About 20 do not. So this is not some new idea or anything like that. On the contrary, as you go back in time and look at history, you find more openness and transparency as a requirement and not this kind of behavior. And so you have right at 20 states that have some language in the rules that either require the bill to be heard or require a report to be done on all bills in a committee, which therefore would then identify, what action was taken on a bill or not and why. You have 20 states that require this. And when I was in the Oklahoma legislature, in one of two tenures that I served, I went to Nebraska once to speak at an event. So I went to their legislature, knew some legislators there, and I was on their floor. Interesting unicameral legislative body. But we got to talking about this because I was pushing it in my home state. And they said, well, yeah, we don't allow that here. We have a hearing for every bill, and invited me to come to their committee meetings to actually watch it in process. And so the point really is here, the world does not come to an end by doing this. On the contrary, it enhances and encourages good government and positive views and feedback from constituents and citizens.
So let's dig into that, because that's an interesting claim. And if 20 states already have this kind of rule, have you observed that those states function better in the long run? Or is there any evidence that this kind of transparency actually causes bills to pass that otherwise would have been buried in committee?
No, I have not seen anything like that, but I'm waiting for that. I've heard all the arguments internally in a legislative body because I served in one and fought this battle for many, many years and had many, many debates behind closed doors and a few out on the floor. And so, but that is one of the big arguments they like to use. The first one is, if we do this, everybody's going to want to have their bill heard and we'll be flooded with bills. That's a big BS. I really want to call it what it deserves to be called, a big BS argument. It's totally false. We already have states that do this, and it doesn't turn out that way. And then the other thing is, I had legislators, the one time this got debated on the House floor, actually get up and say what I'm getting ready to tell you right now. We talk about it in the book and name the names. You can even go to the Oklahoma website right now, and you could, if you go to the right dates, you can see this debate and see these legislators talking about their constituents that are dumb and not very smart. But one of them brings up that we had a bill in Oklahoma a couple of years before that time in which it would require barbecue restaurants to have cloth napkins only and would prohibit paper napkins in barbecue restaurants. Now, that's pretty stupid. And so, that was his argument. And he said, you guys need us to stop, not even let that legislation have a hearing so you don't waste your time. And that's the big bull crap about it, because we waste way more time than we would ever need just doing nothing or recognizing, you name it, So that's a false argument.
Yeah. But also, I'm thinking to an example where it's not a committee that essentially buries a bill, but it's a speaker specifically. There were many examples in recent times in the House of Representatives federally where there was a bill that would have gotten basically 70% support, all of one party plus half of the other, right? But the current speaker would just bury it because the majority of his conference was against the bill. And so that essentially gives 21.01% the ability to veto any bill in this case. In what you're proposing, that power would go away as well, right?
Well, yeah, it would make the legislators more responsible for their individual actions. So the answer to the barbecue restaurant paper napkin bill is to let it be called up, let the members say this bill would prohibit paper napkins, blah, blah, blah. If anybody wants to ask questions, they can. That'll take a minute or two or five, probably not on a bill like that. And somebody can immediately say, I move to table the bill, or just call a vote on it and vote it down. And then everybody says, okay, next, go to the next one. And you could maybe waste 5 minutes on something like that or less, depending on who won. You'd probably have some members on a bill like that would want to ask some Q&A for fun, or to beat up on the author for even bringing a bill like that.
Yeah. But I think we all agree on barbecue napkins, so that's kind of an easy one. I'm thinking more about something like aid to Ukraine and the U.S. Congress, right? There was a clear majority supporting passing the previous aid package, right? But the majority of Republicans was against it. But that was still a minority of all of U.S. Congress. That essentially elongated the process by many months until eventually Speaker Mike Johnson actually put the bill to a vote, if I remember correctly. That is something that looks kind of odd to a foreigner like me. I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, if the majority of representatives support something, why can't they just vote on it today? Why do they have to wait for the speaker, who doesn't represent all of Congress? He only represents his party's conference, right? Why can he delay it by this many months unilaterally, essentially?
Well, because they let him do that. That really is the answer. And in these 30 states, in the individual legislatures, the reason they have it that way is it's evolved that way, but they let it happen. You'd have to have enough legislators that want to, and from time to time this happens, at least in our legislature, and I suspect in other ones, the angst and the unhappiness for how minorities, even within the majority, get treated and discriminated against, that they kind of build up and they fight back. And I could talk about that, how we've seen that happen. But the bottom line is, and this is what I believe, and this is what I have said all along the way publicly over and over and over again, this is immoral to do this, because we have God-given rights in this country that we claim, and those include the First Amendment, free speech, and redress of government. And when this happens, you cannot have free speech. You either have it or not. It's like pregnancy or other things. You either have it or you don't. And then also redress of government. If you're stopping a duly elected representative or senator from speaking on behalf of his clients, that has to include offering recourse, meaning legislation, but they are prohibited from time to time. Some members get prohibited all the time because they fight back so hard, they get some real serious retribution from the leadership, payback. And the legislature obviously was not supposed to function like that. It was supposed to function so that it decides, not some super legislator that was not elected by the state or by others. Look, the bottom line is, Alex, this is about, what drives this is money and power. And it's primarily special interest groups, large donors, and then those who get elected that care about moving up the ladder, finding, feather in their own nest as opposed to just doing the right thing.
Yeah. And honestly, intuitively, it seems to me like the last part is the main one. You don't actually need lobbyists and donors for somebody who can have the possibility of having extra power, wanting extra power, right? So if the speaker can be more powerful, the speaker is going to be more powerful whether or not there are lobbyists on his doorstep, because why not?
Well, you ask about a bill, and then here's one in Oklahoma that was a big deal. Back when Obamacare passed in 2008, states all over the country were rumbling, at least, and many filed bills to either nullify it, to change it, to do different things like that. Well, in Oklahoma, we had two bills that would nullify. One of them would nullify all of Obamacare in the state of Oklahoma, period. The other one just nullified the individual mandate of Obamacare. Well, they both passed out of committee, large numbers, very strong. And the leadership was deciding, as they do, which one would get to go to the floor, which, there's no reason we had to have leadership to decide that for us. The legislature is created and enacted for that purpose. But they held it back. And me being in the insurance business, I was one of the leads in opposing this and did on the House floor. So we kept asking, hey, what's the holdup? Which one are you going to let go through and all that kind of stuff? Well, they let the light version go through. I contend, and it passed in flying colors. It sent to a vote of the people their agreement, which they did, but they would have voted for either version. And most people in the state of Oklahoma thought they voted for a full nullification. That's what they really thought. And I think if they would have left it alone, the full nullification bill would have passed, and it would have been a very important and large example and kind of shining example and light for other states to do the same thing, which many others were trying to do the same thing, had legislators that wanted them to do that, including constituents. But powers that be get in the way, special interest, donors that might represent companies like United Healthcare, Blue Cross and Blue Shield, et cetera, that ended up benefiting in some way or another from that law.
Yeah, and if I remember this debate correctly, then nullifying only the individual mandate where keeping the rest of the law out there is basically a guarantee of spiraling insurance prices, right?
Yep.
So they essentially allowed the thing to pass, which was going to die its own death anyway, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that is a really interesting example. Let's dig into the prescriptive part. I know that you described this in your book, but what exactly should people do if we want to fix this? Let's say we call our local representative, our federal representative. We're telling them, please pass a bill that says what?
Well, the bill that will stop any other legislator, whether they're a chairman of a committee or they have any title or not, if they have some ability to stop somebody from hearing a bill, it would prohibit that. Just stop it altogether. So no more asking if your bill can be heard. Like with hat in hand, maybe get down on one knee. Can you please hear my bill or bills this year?
Is there still going to be nitpicking on the edges of saying, yeah, your bill can be heard. You're on the schedule for 2 years from now and you have 17 seconds. Is that going to happen?
No, I don't think so. I think because they're either going to hear it or not. There are other rules. Speaking of not knowing anything about the rules, I despise the rules. I'm the type, I do not like rules at all. I like to violate the rules, if anything. But this one in particular, so I didn't pursue this because think highly of the rules, or I'm a rules expert, Masons or whatever. It's really the principle of this. And so here's a quick story. In the course of fighting this battle along the way, there was a run for speaker of the next speaker of the House. So we're in a session. The next speaker of the House is going to be voted on within the majority caucus, which is our Republicans at that time. And so that's going on between two guys. One of them's a seemed to be a conservative. The other one seemed to be a moderate. I actually liked the conservative guy, and I had just had this bill as an amendment heard on the House floor for the first day of a 2-year cycle. And so it was fresh on everybody's mind. And we're at one of those times where people are really, they've been stepped on and discriminated against enough. There are a lot of people who got their feathers ruffled about this. So there's a lot of talk about it. So they're trying to get my vote for that next speaker. And what I did is I sat down with one of those candidates and about 4 or 5 other guys. We were actually on the floor around my desk talking about this. And so we're actually having a little mini debate. And it went basically, I'm cutting it down quite a bit. And I'd been through this so many times over the years, it's the same template every time. So we're talking about it, and somebody brings up the question, the speaker candidate brings up, he goes, well, if we do this, everybody's going to want to have all their bills heard, and we're going to have a jillion more bills that we're going to have to hear, and that's going to be overwhelming. Well, that sells to a group where they don't, they've just lived this one way for a long time. So we start talking about that, and in the middle of debating that, I say, well, look, it's a principle, it's a moral issue. It should just be real simple. Everybody's treated fairly. But the way to address that, if everybody really thinks that's a problem, that we're going to have to hear a lot more bills, put a limit on it, but make it equal for every member. And so we start talking about numbers. And I said something like 10, just because I know it's all just a function that we're going through. And everybody starts thinking 10, and they multiply times the total members. And what's that number? And that's a whole lot, and blah, blah, blah. And we go, well, it could be 5, it could be 8. And the one member speaks up and says, well, we've got that 8 limit bill that's already in the rules, and they don't even honor that. And everybody goes, yeah, that's right. Well, a little background on that real quick is about 10 years ago, I was there when that happened, when people got ticked off because their bills wouldn't get heard, and they were ready to go after the leadership. Okay, look, let's make this rule that if you make your top 8 bills priority, you'll get those heard. And it wasn't really written in stone in the rules, but it was strongly implied. Well, so time goes by and they don't even honor that. So we're having this conversation. The members, it was a real good point because it brought up the fact the leadership is not about doing the right thing. They're about getting their way. So somebody says, yeah, they don't even honor that. So I said, well, what about 3? How about if every member had 3? That's maybe 300 more bills, maybe blah, blah, blah. Would you be for that? And everybody goes, well, yeah. And so the speaker guy is sitting right next to me. Nice guy. I love him. Actually, he's a really good guy. I turn to him and I say, TW was his name. I say, hey, TW, well, would you be for every member having at least the right to have 1 bill every year, just 1? And he kind of went, kind of stumbled around and stammered. And the other guys are looking like, yeah, 1? I mean, everybody's thinking, what's wrong with 1? I mean, 1 can't be a problem. And he got up and said, I've got stuff to do. I got to leave and go do stuff, which frankly was true, but also it was a good time to get out of getting nailed down and backed into a corner. But that's really what it gets down to. And I tell that story every time if I can, because the issue really is, as all these arguments come around, what rights do we as individuals have when we send somebody up there to represent us? And is this reasonable to hear 1 bill? Are you kidding me? Well, then who's getting their bills heard if we're having to go through this?
Yeah. Well, essentially, whether it's 1 or 10, it's the removal of the veto power that this person had. Right? If there's even 1 that you can do without his consent, then he has no veto power anymore.
Exactly. And that's exactly the essence of this whole issue. And it leaves it up to the legislative body, which have been sent there by the people. And it means the people's will be closer to being done by eliminating this corrupt power.
So let me ask you about another, I would say, competing solution that I've seen implemented elsewhere. Some states have a proposition system where citizens themselves, but I guess gathering enough signatures, can propose a proposition that will be put to a vote, even if nobody in the legislature has any interest in people being allowed to vote on this. Do you think that addresses at least some of the issue, even though basically it doesn't fix the legislature? It just says the legislature is broken. Let's pass rules without the legislature and supersede their rules. Does that work?
Well, very great question and very interesting because I've been talking to, since the book came out, a lot of people are reading it, to other legislators and people that are activists that work with them in some other states. And in Oklahoma, we do have that citizens initiative petition and by other names law in our states, and it's used from time to time very effectively. But some states don't, and that's why this conversation came up in some Zoom meetings with legislators and activists that want to get this addressed in their state. And in Oklahoma, we're expecting to do this the very beginning of 2026. There's a strategy behind why we're doing it at that time instead of sooner. But we are going to do that because we fully don't expect the legislature to ever address this issue or fix it. If they do, it'll be a patch, which they did once before to try to make it look like they were doing something, but it was a fake out. That's what it was. So, the initiative petition process, if you have that in your state, it's an excellent opportunity to do some reforms like this. And I would be happy to help anybody. I work with a lot of people. I'd be happy to work with anybody on that.
Well, I'm in Texas. I don't think I do, but I used to live in California, which does and uses propositions very actively, as far as I can tell.
And it's really hard if you don't have that, because then you have to go that other route, which is in Oklahoma, we've got 101 House members. Well, you've got to get enough of them that are going to be willing to stand up on that day to offer an amendment to change the rules. And most of them are afraid to do that because they're afraid to be discriminated against.
And this is why I started my list of questions from the personnel question, right? Because you're much more likely to get half of the members to stand up and try to vote for something like this if you have a lot of new blood. If all your members are repeat customers, essentially, and they've already been in this system and they've already operated under the old rules and have adjusted and managed to get reelected under the old rules, why would they stick their neck out and try to take a risk to change the rules?
Well, I mean, it's a great question because, I mean, it's really, I kind of break down, let's say it like this, people that get elected to a legislative body, it's not easy to pigeonhole people, and it's not even fair a lot of times. But when we're talking about electing people to political positions like this, you're going to have people that are really there to get what they can for themselves. They're really looking out for them, number one. And then you're going to have some people that are trying to do the right thing, but they're influenced by all of this that goes on. And they can be easily influenced and maybe have one foot on each side of that equation. But then you're going to have others that get elected that are fully committed to doing what they said they were going to do, and they're pursuing that, and they're not going to be compromised. That's one way that it's not the perfect way. That's one way I kind of divide it up from my experience of 18 years in a legislative body. And most people don't want to be singled out or marginalized anymore. They want to in society, like you go back to school, and that kind of thing, or any job, any kind of situation. Nobody wants to be either the oddball that stands out or something like that. So you've got fear as a big motivator. So when you look at a full body, you know that everybody's not going to be on the same side there, because some people really don't want this change because, like the legislator that said, you need us to stop legislation like this that you don't want to cast a vote on. I heard that argument behind closed doors in our closed caucus meetings a number of times when we would fight about this behind closed doors. And they would say it to us even more kind of directly and blatantly. Like if there's a vote on a tax issue, some of you guys and gals come from districts where they're not going to be for that at all, or whatever the issue is. And you need us to stop it so you don't have to go on record. And think about really what that's implying. It's we need to have our people on record. And that's what we're not getting. And that's what's helping pervert the system and corrupt it. We need clear records of what people are saying and doing. Another member, I'll tell you this story real quick. When we had that debate on the floor, there were two Republicans at the time, and I'm a Republican, and we were battling this. So I get the last debate because I'm the author of the amendment. one of the other guys in leadership, a Republican that debated against it, he said, and I'm going to paraphrase, people can read the book and get it verbatim, or they could go on the website and hear it for themselves. The guy gets up and he says, we all know, and he's a good old Okie, probably like a Texan, get some of that good rural country kind of accent. He goes, we've got a bunch of constituents that come to us. They want us to pass certain legislation, and some of them aren't too smart, but they come to us and they say, hey, file a bill to do X. So you don't really want to do that, but you do it, and you get up there and you can go to that committee chairman and say, I only filed this bill because I have this constituent that had this harebrained idea, blah, blah, blah. If you just kind of wink and say, yeah, I'm not going to hear that bill, I'll just tell him I couldn't get the committee chairman to hear it. And we'll all go down the road. And I'll go down and tell the constituent, gee, I gave it the good old try. I couldn't believe he said it on the floor, being recorded. And it's still there. But that tells the real plain, sober, truth about this, that's really the way things are in life. And it's no different in a legislative body. And it's why we need to have this in law, in my opinion, because they will either never do it, or if they do it, when people stop paying close attention, they'll change it again.
Yeah, that sounds very realistic. I've heard those arguments a lot on the federal level as well. I did see one more trick pulled on the federal level that blew my mind at some point, which was done without committees burying things. But I don't remember which bill that was in the Senate. But there were a lot of good amendments to it, and nobody wanted to vote against the amendments because then they would be on the record voting against the amendments. So a whole bunch of, I think it was Democrats at that point, voted for all the proposed amendment. And then at the end, Chuck Schumer proposed an amendment to cancel all the previous amendments. And they all voted for that as well, and basically eliminated all the stuff that they had just voted on to be on the record that, yes, we're supporting this good idea. And then they just eliminated all of it at the end.
Yeah, I mean, the more they're left to their own, to them and whoever's up there, which is not we the people, they're gonna they're gonna change the way they do things. It'll get worse. It won't get better.
All right. I want to end on an optimistic note. Can you outline a vision for us of what is the best case scenario? You passed this in Oklahoma, you passed this in a whole bunch of other states. What are the next steps? What are we able to do? How will we get government to actually function better?
Well, I think the first thing is what we're doing right now. And it doesn't get the credit it deserves, which is people talking about it and making other people aware of it and understanding it. Because as I've gone through and talked about this, the way this started with me, again, is I was in the legislature, I experienced this, so I started exploring ways to do something about it. I started getting press and started getting some good press. It was all good, actually, because it makes sense for everybody. It doesn't matter what party you're in or whatever. It's just about equality and fairness. And so as time went on, it made people more aware of it. So now, today, as I talk about this, as I've written this book about it, it blows people's mind. I've gone to probably 60 or 70 different groups, mainly here in Oklahoma, to talk about this. And these are activists, and they don't understand it, but it turns a light on in people's minds about, I see, this one little thing and how it has such gives the ability for people to, subvert maybe the original intent of how this body is supposed to function. So we don't have any choice but to inform and educate. And then if you're in a state like if Texas doesn't have any alternative, Iowa is another one. We could go down a list and name them. You have to have activists that will then go to sitting legislators or people that are running for office, inform and educate them and get their commitment to change this when they have the opportunity. And that's how it started here in Oklahoma. I started doing it myself. I got publicity. The Democrats were in the majority. Time went by. Republicans took the majority. More people became aware of this, and they started lobbying candidates for office and others that were in office. And so it just built momentum and numbers over time. Now we happen in Oklahoma to have a very strong and successful grassroots organization that's very organized, that's come together. And I think that's going to be the basis for us being able to circulate the petition, get the signatures, and get it on the ballot for the people to vote on it in 2026.
So if that happens in Oklahoma in 2026, how can we replicate that in 30 more states where it also needs to change? And how do we get that on the federal level? And then we still have to resolve all the problems of money and politics and things like that. What's the path?
Yeah, we got lots of problems. Well, we got to start somewhere, and so this is a good place, because until you here's a scenario that I've thought up, that when I go speak, I bring this up with the current people that are at the federal level right now. Let's say we had a major event that happened. Let's say a nuclear bomb or some other major explosion went off in the United States. Excuse me. Or let's say it was an economic calamity of some type or natural disaster. But let's say it was more political nature, political, economic. The people that are at the federal level right now, I don't trust them. And I don't want them to take over power. Let's put it this way. Let's say Kamala Harris and Tim Walz get elected. I think a lot of us know what their politics is really about and what they intend to do. We need to have state elected officials, whether they be governors, state reps, senators, Speaker of the House, or whoever it is, to stand up for our constitutional or God-given rights and say, well, no, we're not going to go along with your executive order to confiscate all firearms from all citizens. We're not going to do that. So we need to have strong people that know what our rights are and are willing to represent the people themselves and not just go along with edicts from somebody that's, quote, up above them. And so I think that's the first thing. We've got to be informed and educated. And once we do that, we can then start bringing around change at our local and state level. Because when this is outed, legislators, they don't like this. They don't like this to be talked about, except the ones that actually want it to happen. Because almost all of them, are taking checks from special interest groups and others. And I'm not suggesting they're all on the take or something like that. Don't get me wrong. But it makes legislators, because I've been there and done that, it makes them feel uncomfortable when people start looking at them and looking at their voting record compared to who's giving them money and things like that. And so when people start looking at that, legislators don't have any way out. You start connecting the dots and it draws a picture.
Yeah, I know you're a politician, so you cannot say most politicians are on the take. I'm an engineer, so I can diagnose things more openly. And so I do think that for the most part, it is absolutely legal in this country. But if you see that, generally speaking, elected officials tend to vote with their donors or tend to vote on interests that match their donors' interest and not what their constituents actually think, that is pretty close to being on the take, even if it happens to be legal. And that is a question that I still don't know how we can address when essentially the goal of an elected representative typically is to get reelected, especially when there are no term limits. And 95% the guy with more money wins. So how can they avoid that?
You're exactly right. And it's the money. It's the money behind it is really the main thing. Money's gotten bigger in politics, so that's why there's more and more people after it. And they're going to desperate extremes to try to get it, retain it, keep it. And when I wrote this book, there was actually a small booklet, a very small one that we had put together that activists wanted to use, again, for campaigning. And then, so when I wrote this one, I had intended, and I did this in the book, we went to legislators around the country, and they're in that book. So you can see what other legislators say. But I also wanted to get into the money, which you brought up just now. And because I knew, God, it's kind of like, don't get me started on this one, But we were going to get into the federal part of the rules and get in the money in general. But we decided not to do that for this reason. This stuff gets complicated and people's eyes glaze over. And now maybe if you start talking about the money and you got some juicy facts, it'll keep your attention. But people can lose their attention and focus on this. And I didn't want to write a book like that. I wanted to get people's minds opened and make it easy for them to see. So we stayed really tight on this one aspect because it has so much power. If you can eliminate this, then you defang those people that want to get into government and use it for their own benefit. And it defangs those leadership. And now everybody gets an equal chance. It's kind of like Truman said, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. If you don't want to be there and make tough decisions, then get the heck out. Don't go in the first place. But there's tough decisions that have to be made, and they're important. We got to make the right decisions and then go home after that.
Yeah. It also sounds like this is an issue you can tackle better as a Republican, whereas money in politics tends to be a Democrat talking point. And in many ways, I don't even know if you can fix it without going and overturning Supreme Court precedents from 1976, right? Because money became speech back then in the US alone and not in other countries. So I don't know if you can fix this at the state level. I'm glad that you're trying to fix whatever can be fixed.
Well, we're looking at it because one of the here's a good question. Like, we all know what we call these dark money PACs, or by other names, where at the later part of an election they come in and start bad mouthing somebody and attacking somebody, and then it's given some name like this is by the Good Citizens PAC of Oklahoma or something, whatever, and nobody knows who that is or anything. And so we were going to dig into that. But let's say you were in politics, and I've been in a position like this, in a peripheral position with other people, where they said, let's create one of those other kind of PACs to help one of the good guys over here, blah, blah, blah. So I saw that happen a couple of times. And you know what? There's no place to go to. Like, if you and I wanted to do that, and we said, let's find out how to do that and go to get it done. You don't really go someplace in the law or somewhere like that and say, here's step 1, step 2, step 3, file this form, do that, do that. There's not anything like that. You actually have to find somebody that has done it before, and it's very specialized, and I'm not even sure if it's all technically legal, to put it one way. So the point I'm making here is that is a deep hole that needs to be fixed. And I wonder if I thought that we might propose some state change for Oklahoma that says, you got to do X or whatever it would say to try to address that. But then you'd have people file suits probably that you can't get into that area for this reason or that. But at least a state should be able to do that within its own boundaries.
In theory, yes, but if money is speech and corporations are people, then how exactly can you do that without running afoul of the First Amendment? That's the concern, right?
Yeah, well, I think if you just require disclosure and disclosure in a reasonable time before an election, that's a tricky point right there. Is there a cutoff time, or do you start denying free speech? But if people don't know what it is, then it could be like somebody crying fire in a theater. It's not a positive thing; it's a negative thing.
Yeah. And it's worth noting, I want to clarify for my listeners, I did not say that I think money is speech and corporations are people. The Supreme Court seems to think that because of First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti and Citizens United, right? So those two things just happen to be precedent in the U.S.
Yeah. And I would say, exactly, I would say transparency, if people think in terms of transparency and openness, that's really, you really can't go wrong with openness and transparency. And when and if there might be something, we like to talk about those what ifs, especially in government. Well, what if X happens? And this is stopping us from addressing this big problem of X that happened to us. Well, you can come up with exceptions. Like if you had a rule on this one, let's just make up something that probably won't make sense. Let's say we had a rule that said you stop this practice, period. When somebody thinks, well, what if there's a natural disaster or there's a huge war and this, that, and the other and blah, blah. And, we need people to act right now somehow. Somehow this is a problem. You could have an exception built in that if the world comes to an end, we get to do something different. You know? And it's usually excuses we make to not do something that.
No, I agree. Look, I grew up in a country where there are a lot of problems. The political system is problematic in many ways, right? But the way political advertising works is that every registered party gets an equal amount of time on national channels only. And there is no other political advertising allowed anywhere under any circumstances. And it works. I don't see a problem with that. Yes, maybe news companies make less money because right now I'm guessing political advertising is the second biggest line item after pharmaceuticals, I think. But other than that, nothing gets broken if you just eliminate that entire genre.
Well, you know, that's something that I've talked about and heard about being in politics all my life. And as a conservative, a constitutionalist, et cetera, you know, there's the concern that if we go down that path, we'll start using taxpayer funds for a lot of other things that we don't really want to or shouldn't. But I tell you that I am very, very strongly open to that because as I think about it, I talk about it with other people in the political realm all the time. I don't see a really good way to fix this other than that, something like that. And so I'd like to see our governments explore that, seriously explore it.
And I would even say, look, we're already paying for PBS and NPR, right? So just put all the ads there. So it doesn't cost the taxpayer any extra money. That airtime is already paid for. Just say the only place where political advertising is allowed is PBS and NPR. And everyone who actually qualified to be on the ballot for this election gets an equal amount of time. And that's it. Everything else is banned.
Yeah. I mean, we can do stuff like that, you know, but when people start arguing about it and fear mongering, you got to stop and think, why are people raising these questions and promoting fear? Is it legitimate or are they just trying to keep change from happening? And oftentimes it's because they're trying to keep change from happening. They're scaring us back into a corner to shut up.
Or they're just going with the tribe and they haven't actually thought it through. They're just for this thing because all my friends seem to be for this thing, even though they haven't thought about it either.
Exactly.
All right. I think that would be I wanted to end on an optimistic note. I'm sorry we couldn't deliver on that one. Let's end on this very realistic one. Charles, thank you so much for joining us. I will add a link to the book and the description of this episode when it comes out in about 3 weeks, I think. And I hope many people will read it and will help promote something similar in their states.
All right. Thanks. Thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
Thanks.